On a Sunday evening in a coastal motel, 20 people decide to leave their lives. Not over months, in a single evening, after a 2-hour talk by two strangers they have never met. Within days they have sold what they owned, given it away, or left it where it stood. Houses, jobs, families. Not one of them believes they are joining a cult, and on that particular point, they are right. Nobody joins a cult. What happens is that a person says yes to something small, and then to something only slightly. The motel is the Bayshore Inn in Waldport, Oregon. The date is September 14th, 1975. The two strangers are a former college music professor named Marshall Applewhite and a former nurse named Bonnie Nettles, and at that point they are calling themselves Bo and Peep. The group they are building will eventually be known as Heaven's Gate. 22 years later, on March 26, 1997, sheriff's deputies in Rancho Santa Fe, California, will open the door of a rented mansion and find 39 people dead in matching black clothes and new running shoes. And one fact reorganizes everything you assume about this story. The 20 who walked out of that motel in 1975 are not the 39 who died in 1997. Reporting on the Oregon coast has consistently held that every one of the Waldport recruits was long gone by the end. The people who fell hardest and fastest, in the most public and most mocked way, got out. So the question is not why people are gullible. It never was. Hold on to those 20. We come back to them. The word cult does hidden work in a sentence. It puts the danger in the group's appearance rather than in its architecture. Nobody in Waldport walked into a room marked cult. They walked into a public meeting advertised on a flyer about unidentified flying objects and heard a proposition that answered a question they were already asking. So this episode takes the thing apart. Not the beliefs, which were unusual, and not the personalities, which were not. The system. Because there is a system, it is not improvised, and people who escaped groups with nothing else in common describe it in nearly identical terms. 4 surfaces: behavior, information, thought, emotion. Control all 4, and you do not need to change a person's mind. Their mind changes itself in the direction the environment is already leaning, and they experience every step of it as their own free decision. That is not a metaphor. That is the finding. We build those 4 surfaces out of the Heaven's Gate record, because that group wrote its own rules down. And one question stays open until the last 2 minutes, because you will not accept the answer until you have seen the machine. Everyone asks how people get in. Almost nobody asks the harder one. Why is the exit so much harder than the entrance? Even for someone who has already worked out that the whole thing is false. Not willpower, not intelligence, not information. It was measured in the 1980s in a study of people who had already left. We start where they started, not with a spaceship, with a small, reasonable request. Marshall Applewhite was born in Spur, Texas in 1931, the son of a Presbyterian minister. He took a philosophy degree at Austin College in 1952 and a master's in music. And by 1965, he was chairing the music department at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. He resigned in 1970 during a period of depression. His father died the following year. In 1972, in Houston, he met Bonnie Nettles, a nurse with a long interest in theosophy and biblical prophecy. That is not the resume of a criminal. It is the resume of an educated, unremarkable, badly frightened, middle-aged man who had lost his profession and his father inside 2 years. The culture's model of a cult leader is a predator selecting victims. The record more often shows 2 people building something neither could have built alone. By 1975, they were touring the western United States, holding meetings in rented rooms, and the proposition was physical. An actual spacecraft, an actual departure. Now, consider who was in that room in Waldport. Somewhere between 150 and 200 people came. They were not selected. They selected themselves, by answering a flyer that asked why the objects were here and who they had come for. Every one of them was already looking. That is the first thing the system needs, and it is not a weakness. It is a state. A person between two versions of their life, between jobs, between marriages, newly bereaved, newly moved. Recruitment does not target the credulous. It targets the transitional. But being interested is not leaving. Something bridges that gap, and it has a name. The foot in the door technique. The definition is narrow. A person who has agreed to a small request becomes substantially more likely to agree to a much larger one afterwards, and more likely than a person asked the large request cold. The case. Waldport did not begin with the spacecraft. It began with attending, then with staying for the second hour, then with speaking to one of the two afterwards, then with agreeing to meet again the next day. Each step was small, and each was freely chosen. And after each one, the person was slightly more the kind of person who does this. The science. In 1966, two psychologists at Stanford, Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser, published a study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology under a title that is itself the whole finding: Compliance Without Pressure. They approached homeowners in California and asked permission to install a large, deliberately ugly billboard reading, "Drive carefully," on the front lawn. Asked cold, 17% said yes. But a second group had been approached 2 weeks earlier with a tiny request, a small sign for the window. Of the people who had agreed to that small sign, 76% now agreed to the billboard. No pressure, no argument, no incentive, just a prior yes. 17 to 76. The strongest variable was not the persuasiveness of the request. It was whether the person had already said yes to something smaller. The modern analog is a category, not a person. It is the onboarding ladder of any high-control direct selling organization, where the first ask is a $50 starter kit and a Saturday, and nobody is ever asked to remortgage anything until the day they are. The order of the requests is the technology, which is why "how could they be so stupid" is a category error. It assumes a moment of decision large enough to be stupid about. In a properly built funnel, there is no such moment. Every step is defensible. The destination is reachable only from the step before. The 20 people who left Waldport had not agreed to die. They had agreed to come back tomorrow. What happens next is that the ground starts to move. In 1974, a 19-year-old poetry student at Queens College in New York was approached on campus by 3 young women. They invited him to dinner. The dinner led to a weekend workshop, and the workshop to another. Within weeks, he had dropped out of college, quit his job, and stopped seeing his friends. The group was the Unification Church, and at no point in that sequence was he told so. Its most effective recruiting operation in California ran under a completely different name, and prospects were invited to a free dinner and then to a farm without being told whose teachings they would be hearing. He rose quickly and worked at the church's national headquarters. His name is Stephen Hassan, and 2 things about him matter here. The first is that in April 1976, after working without meaningful sleep, he fell asleep at the wheel of a fundraising van and drove into an 18-wheeler. He survived with a broken leg. That accident put him in a hospital bed, then in a room with his family, then in 5 days of intensive deprogramming arranged by his father. And at the end of it, he no longer believed. The second is what he did afterwards. Hassan spent the following decades as a licensed mental health counselor, took a master's in counseling psychology in 1985 and a doctorate in 2021, and published Combating Cult Mind Control in 1988. His model is known now by 4 letters, BITE, and the letters are the 4 surfaces: behavior, information, thought, emotional control. I want to be exact about the status of that model. BITE is a practitioner's framework built from clinical casework and interviews with former members. It is not a validated psychometric instrument, and a substantial group of religious studies scholars regard the whole family of mind control models as an inheritance of discredited 1950s brainwashing theory. We deal with that argument later. Use BITE as a map. Do not use it as a verdict. Surface 1. Behavior control. Heaven's Gate is where you see it in its purest recorded form because the group typed out its own rules. By April 1976, it had stopped recruiting entirely and gone underground. It banned sex, drugs, and alcohol. Members surrendered their possessions and lived without private property. Men and women wore the same loose clothing, cut so that the shape of a body was unreadable, and everyone had the same close-cropped hair. Applewhite's stated logic was that they were moving toward a world without gender, so they would stop signaling it. Then it goes further. Every member was assigned what the group called a check partner. You did not perform actions alone, you performed them with your assigned partner, and you did not act on your own judgment. In the most demanding period, students reported to a central point at staggered 11-minute intervals, arriving 2 at a time, standing for a minute, returning to their tasks, and coming back 11 minutes later, from waking until bed. There was a written procedure for essentially every waking moment. One woman's schedule, described afterwards to a sociologist, had her bathing at 5:57 in the evening, drinking a protein shake at 6:36, and going to bed for 2 hours at 9:54. And there is a document, dated spring 1988, that the group kept and that survives on its own website. It lists major offenses and lesser offenses. Among the major ones, deceit, which includes keeping an offense secret rather than reporting it the same day. Among the lesser ones, in the group's own words, trusting my own judgment, using my own mind, taking any action without using my check partner, having private thoughts, staying in my own head. Read that as an engineer, not as a moralist. It is not a code of virtue, it is a specification. Every item removes one component of an independent person: private thought, private judgment, private action, the private minute. In the 1990s, 8 of the men, Applewhite among them, were surgically castrated. The first attempt was made by a member and went badly enough to nearly kill the patient. The rest were carried out by a surgeon in Mexico. At the time, it was reported as the outer limit of religious asceticism. Hold that. It does not mean what it appears to mean. Now the science under behavior control, because this is not obedience for its own sake. The mechanism is called effort justification, and it comes out of Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance. When a person voluntarily pays a heavy price for something, the mind resolves the discomfort of that cost not by regretting it, but by revaluing the thing upward. You do not conclude that you were foolish. You conclude that it must have been worth it. The case is from 1959. Elliot Aronson and Judson Mills recruited students for a discussion group and required some to pass an initiation. For one group, it was mildly embarrassing. For another, severely embarrassing. Then everyone listened to the same recording of the same discussion, which had been made deliberately dull. The students who had endured the severe initiation rated that dull discussion, and the people in it, markedly higher than the others did. Nothing about the group had changed, only what it had cost. And the cost is what generated the value, which is why the schedule, the shaved head, the surrendered property, and the 11-minute check-ins are not incidental to the belief. They are the manufacturing process for it. Every hour of unpleasantness a member absorbs is an hour that has to be justified, and the only justification available inside that environment is that the thing being served is real. The modern analog, again a category, any workplace culture that treats exhaustion as evidence of commitment. The organization is not extracting loyalty by force. It manufactures loyalty as a byproduct of the labor, and the loyalty is genuine, so behavior is accounted for. But a person controlled only in their behavior still has a window on the outside world, and through that window, they can measure. That window closes next. Surface 2. Information control. The anchor here is older than Byte and considerably more respected. In 1961, the psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton published Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, based on interviews with 25 Westerners and 15 Chinese who had been through political re-education in China. He identified 8 criteria of what he called thought reform, and he listed one of them first for a reason. He called it milieu control, control of communication, both within the environment and ultimately within the individual, producing significant isolation from the wider society. Notice the second half of that, ultimately within the individual. Lifton's point was not simply that the group censors the male. It is that after long enough, the member polices their own inner communication, and the external censor becomes unnecessary. The case. In April 1976, Heaven's Gate stopped public recruiting and disappeared for 17 years. Members severed contact with their families. They took new names. They moved constantly. In small units the group called the class. Whatever news of the outside reached them was interpreted for them, and the interpretation ran through one man. When they re-emerged in 1994 and went back on tour, roughly doubling their number, the people they gathered walked into an environment that had been sealed for nearly 2 decades. Now the third surface, and this one does the deepest work: thought control. Lifton's name for the central technique is loading the language. The group compresses complex, contested human situations into short, absolute, group-specific phrases, and those phrases end thinking rather than start it. Lifton's term for the products is thought-terminating cliches. Heaven's Gate is the clearest specimen in the record. Its own materials are still online. A human body was not a body. It was a vehicle, a container, something you are issued temporarily and step out of. Death was not death. It was exiting the vehicle, or graduation. The destination was not heaven, which would have carried 2,000 years of complication. It was the next level, the evolutionary level above human, clean, technical, procedural. The destruction of the entire planet and everyone on it was not a catastrophe. It was recycling, spading under the garden so it can be replanted. And the resistance a member might feel to any of this, the ordinary attachment to being alive and to the people you love, was not doubt. It was the influence of the Luciferians, a species of adversary aliens the group held were operating through governments, religions, and specifically through families. Sit with that last one, because it is the most efficient piece of engineering in the system. The doctrine did not merely discourage contact with your mother. It classified your mother as an instrument of the enemy. A member who missed their family did not experience that feeling as love. They experienced it as contamination, requiring correction. That is what loading the language does. It does not win the argument. It removes the words in which the argument could be had. When the only available term for your own death is graduation, there is no sentence left inside the language you now speak in which dying is a bad outcome. This is not confined to groups with spacecraft. Consider NXIVM, the Albany organization founded in 1998 that sold executive success seminars, and whose founder, Keith Raniere, was convicted in federal court in June 2019 on charges including racketeering, sex trafficking, and forced labor conspiracy, and sentenced in October 2020 to 120 years. Inside it, coercion was routinely described in the vocabulary of self-improvement. A secret subgroup ran on a master and slave structure and required each woman entering it to hand over damaging material about herself: photographs, confessions, family secrets. In the group's own language, this was not blackmail, it was collateral. In 2017, women in that subgroup were branded on the body with a cauterizing pen. They were told the symbol represented the 4 classical elements. It contained the founder's initials: And you already know the older case from this channel. In a settlement in Guyana in 1978, the phrase for what 900 people were being asked to do was revolutionary suicide. And the drills that made it routine were called white nights. What matters here is only the overlap. Same device, no spacecraft required. The modern analog, as a category, every closed community that develops a private vocabulary in which its critics are already categorized, and in which the words for doubt, for leaving, and for the people outside are supplied in advance. 3 surfaces are installed: behavior, information, thought. A person inside them is not a prisoner. Every door is open, they have their own legs, and many of them still have money, which raises the obvious objection, and it is the right objection. Why does anyone stay? Surface 4. Emotional control. The technique Hassan puts at the center of it he calls phobia indoctrination, the deliberate installation of an intense, irrational fear attached to questioning the leadership or to leaving, so that the exit is not merely costly, but unthinkable. His clinical claim is blunt. He describes phobia indoctrination as the single most powerful technique for keeping people dependent, and reports that the people he worked with routinely included members who had stopped believing the doctrine long ago and still could not walk out. Read that again, because it is the hinge of this episode. Belief and captivity come apart. The person can already know. It changes less than you would expect. In Heaven's Gate, the phobia was total, and it was cosmological. Leaving did not mean disappointment. It meant remaining on a planet scheduled to be spaded under, in a body that would be recycled with it, having thrown away the only vehicle out. There was no version of leaving in which you were merely wrong. You were choosing annihilation. Now, the honest complication, because a documentary that skips it is doing public relations. In 1983, the American Psychological Association convened a task force on deceptive and indirect methods of persuasion and control, chaired by Margaret Singer, the leading academic proponent of coercive persuasion. The task force delivered its report in November 1986. On May 11, 1987, the association's Board of Social and Ethical Responsibility rejected it, in a memorandum stating that the report lacked the scientific rigor and even-handed critical approach necessary for the association's endorsement, and adding that the board did not believe it had sufficient information to take a position on the issue at all. Singer and a colleague sued the association in 1992 and lost in 1994. After that, courts largely stopped accepting brainwashing testimony as expert evidence. That is not a footnote. It is why the field is contested. Many scholars of new religious movements hold that mind control models overstate the group's power and understate the members' agency, and that the framework is a moral campaign wearing scientific clothes. Rejecting the label is not rejecting the observations. What the association declined to endorse was a specific claim, that these techniques constitute a distinct and demonstrated form of coercion sufficient to override individual will. Nobody disputes the underlying inventory. Foot in the door and effort justification are replicated. Cognitive dissonance is among the most tested constructs in the discipline. Lifton's 8 criteria are descriptive fieldwork of a high standard. Sleep restriction degrades judgment. Isolation degrades reality testing. The mechanism is real. The word brainwashing is the part that failed peer review. And to be scrupulous in both directions, one of the most famous studies in this area, Festinger's field report on a 1950s flying saucer group, When Prophecy Fails, has recently been challenged in the Journal of the History of the Behavioral Sciences on archival grounds. Cognitive dissonance survives on laboratory evidence. That particular story may not. Which brings us to the ending, and to what the 4 surfaces were actually protecting. Heaven's Gate had a prophecy problem from the beginning. In June 1976, in a national forest in Wyoming, the group gathered, and the promised craft did not arrive. In 1985, Bonnie Nettles died of cancer, which the doctrine had not allowed for, since the plan required members to ascend physically. Applewhite told them she had gone ahead to the next level, and the doctrine was revised so that consciousness, not the body, made the trip. Every one of those failures cost members. Every one also deepened the people who stayed, exactly as the dissonance research predicts. When the price rises and the evidence turns, the people with the least invested leave, and the people with the most invested revalue. In late 1996, an amateur claim circulated on late-night radio that an object was traveling in the shadow of Comet Hale-Bopp. Applewhite told his group the marker had arrived. In October, they rented a mansion in Rancho Santa Fe and released 2 videos offering the public a last chance to leave the planet. Between March 22nd and March 24th, 1997, 39 people, 21 women and 18 men, aged 26 to 72, died in 3 groups over 3 days, in shifts, so that each group could arrange the one before it. They took phenobarbital in applesauce or pudding with vodka. They wore identical black shirts and trousers, new black and white running shoes, and armband patches reading Heaven's Gate Away Team. Each carried a $5 bill and 3 quarters. They were found on March 26th after a man who had left the group weeks earlier received a package in the post and drove out to the house. He had left weeks earlier, which is the whole question. So why is the exit harder than the entrance? And what actually gets people out? In 1987, the sociologist Stuart Wright published a monograph called Leaving Cults: The Dynamics of Defection. He interviewed 45 people who had left the Unification Church, the Hare Krishnas, and the Children of God voluntarily, without deprogramming, and looked for what the exits had in common. It was not argument. It was not evidence. Almost nobody in his sample reasoned their way out from the inside. The 2 things that predicted an exit were structural. The first was a breakdown in the group's insulation, some crack in the sealed environment, an outside job, an errand, an unsupervised conversation. The second was stronger, and Wright called it dyadic exclusivity. A private bond, usually a romantic one, that became more important to the 2 people inside it than the group was. In his sample, where a defector was half of a couple, the partner left too, every time. The exit is not an idea. It is a person. One relationship the organization does not control, with someone on the other end who does not attack the belief, because attacking the belief only proves the phobia correct and closes the last door. You can watch that run in the documented modern case. In early 2017, one woman in NXIVM concluded the organization was built on obligation and fear, and left. Her husband did not believe her and stayed. Over the following months, he came around, left, and compared notes with a long-standing member who had discovered that the symbol burned into her body was not the 4 elements. They took the story to the New York Times in October 2017. The prosecutions followed. It did not begin with evidence. It began with one marriage the group had not managed to get inside. Now go back to the castrations. Go back to the ban on sex, the assigned check partner, the offense of having a private thought, the offense of taking any action without your partner, the clothing designed to make bodies unreadable, and the 11-minute intervals that ensured no 2 people were ever alone together for long. Read as religious asceticism, that is severity. Read as engineering, it is precise. It is the systematic elimination of the one thing the research says gets people out. Not doubt, not information. A private, unmanaged bond with one other human being. Heaven's Gate did not merely close the exits. It removed the mechanism by which an exit gets discovered. And now, the 20 from Waldport, who left everything in an evening in 1975, and who were for 22 years the standing joke about how easily people are fooled. They got out. They still had a world outside to be pulled back into, ties the system had not yet had time to sever, and the environment around them in those first years was still leaking. They were not smarter than the 39. They were earlier. Several hundred people passed through this group across 22 years. 39 were there at the end. That number is not a measure of how persuasive the doctrine was. It is a measure of how long it takes to close 4 surfaces on a person, and how many walk out while there is still a gap. Nobody joins a cult. People say yes to a Sunday evening, and to a small sign in the window, and to a schedule, and to a partner who checks. The door does not slam. It is closed by the person walking through it, one reasonable step at a time. And the last thing removed is never the freedom to leave. It is everyone who might have noticed you were gone.